Okay, they're in the woods. The camera keeps on moving. I think they're looking for some witch or something. I don't know. I wasn't listening. Nothing's happening. Nothing's happening. Something about a map. Nothing's happening.
God of War Ragnarok is one of the most conflicting gaming experiences I have had this year, and I'm going to try my best to thoroughly explain my concerns about the current state of the God of War series. Just for background information, I have played every single God of War game except Betrayal, which is on the flip phone, so I have no interest unless it's ported on a proper gaming system. I played on the Show Me No Mercy difficulty. I almost didn't pick that because the series is notorious for having spongy enemies. However, I heard that the game was too simplistic on the lower options, so I ultimately picked what I believe was the safest option for a challenging but not overly tedious experience. I finished the game around 25 hours without complaining. I finished the game around 25 hours without completing side missions, which is something I'll get back to later, maybe. This will be a spoiler-free review with some minor combat spoilers, and feel free to ask me about spoilers in the comments, which is the last place you should be if you're trying to avoid important plot details. This review will start out rough, but don't worry, I have positive points to make, because overall this is a good game. However, I do have plenty of concerns with its design. I may dance around some story aspects to help myself explain a criticism. However, I'll keep it as vague as possible so that players that have finished the story can pick up on. God of War is one of the few video game franchises that had an interesting story to me. The third God of War had an incredible conclusion that sticks to me to this very day. The 2018 release of God of War was okay in this department, however the characters are very creative in design and easily engaging. Though the story around them is extremely safe and I hate to say formulaic, unfortunately Ragnarok is worse in this department, with exposition that I personally do not care for. I despise an over-explained and simplified plot because I don't get a chance to process possibilities and figure out what's happening on my own. Whenever something happened, it was usually after an exposition dump that leads to a scene becoming wildly predictable. To close out this section, I wasn't satisfied with the story, and I felt it took the safest direction possible. The most I got out of it was the immersive character reactions and development, especially for one character in particular. Another thing that bothered me was the poorly established hatred towards the main antagonist. The entire run of the game makes this villain sound so terrible, yet we hardly ever see heavy despicable traits, and mainly we get manipulation, which wasn't enough in my opinion. Moving on to the gameplay, which is the most important aspect for me. A game can have a terrible story, but if the gameplay is good, then I simply don't care what they do. The main character could steal and destroy candy from kids for all I care. Playing the game will always be the main priority. The combat mechanics is most definitely an improvement, however the encounters themselves suffers from the same formula repeated several times, which made fighting tedious, especially when enemies are hell sponges. Most boss fights also lack the wow factor except for the duo fights and a few cinematic focus bosses that are strangely well thought out in comparison. The encounters I found the most atrocious were the ones that requires excessive striking instead of properly calculating enemy behavior due to designs including enemies that do not complement each other at all. I would be focused on a larger enemy and get randomly flanked by something behind Kratos. Of course you can use the character's warnings, the attack indicator, or cautionary rolling. However, with such a large blind spot, it's not engaging enough to properly navigate the battle to your advantage sometimes. Thankfully these specific scenarios didn't happen very often, but when they did, it made the game feel very stale and unsatisfying for me. The level design started out very strong just to become a rare occasion throughout. The elevated platforms really helped out with fights that contain enemies that do not properly complement each other in a standard arena. So I'm not sure why the developers designed certain encounters in such a mundane manner when they had a good formula to work with and expand upon. The endgame gets even worse with straight paths to fight enemies in, which didn't immerse me in battle, and I'm also sure that they wanted you to run past certain areas due to the amount of accessible platforms. The following encounters mentioned will not contain footage due to spoilers. One battle in particular felt broken due to a certain mechanic not working 100% of the time, which created terrible RNG. And it was the second time I saw the fight formula within the hour, with the only difference being that a cinematic event occurs, which adds on to the annoyance. This event also gives you an option to escape the fight, which I did just due to the fragile design of the encounter. Here's another example I can get more detailed with. So the main gimmick with this encounter is to gain control of one of the two ogres, and basically dominate the entire fight. To get you to that point, you must juggle around enemies, which usually requires running to gain a proper visual. However, the enemies involved have a high aggression design, so you can't fully place concentration on the ogre at all times, which means you must successfully use cooldown attacks, rage attacks, and arrows to achieve a stun event for a back ride. Is this a difficulty option or a design issue? I would say both, but mostly on design, which could be fixed with a simple elevating of platforms to properly space out smaller aggressive enemies. This, when executed properly, could gain a stun event. Now, with that said, I don't know how well controlling the ogre would work on elevated platforms, and at the moment of writing, I do not recall an encounter to compare that suggested design to. Let's get into the things I appreciated a lot about the game, because I feel like I have talked about the issues too much so far, and I really need a less depressing expression of opinion. So I really enjoyed the gameplay when the arena and enemies complement each other well. If it was consistently satisfying and entertaining, then I would be a lot more enthusiastic in this review. Some boss fights were an absolute blast cinematically, which is what the series is still incredible at. I didn't despise all of the interactive cinematic moments. There was one that I really loved that I wish had better fights in between sections, which is the formula the game sticks with for the most part. This cinematic in particular was very thrilling, with very interesting visuals and one dialogue exchange between two characters that really stuck out to me just due to the threatening immersion of the scene. There are other scenes like this, but they are a lot shorter in scale and not as memorable. Animations that occur after engaging a stun event is such a treat to watch, and sometimes makes grinding through encounters worth just to see the many variations. I found myself focusing more on aggression just to get them though, and I wish there was a beneficial combat reward for doing so, like combustion or simply throwing an enemy. The addition of guard breaking was an interesting mechanic to utilize, where you need to double tap block when blue rings appear in order to interrupt an attack or break an enemy's guard, which added an intriguing aspect in combat, and I wish there were more new battle ideas, especially to make the more tedious encounters less mundane. There is a change in gameplay that starts fairly early on that some players may find jarring, but I actually preferred it at times in combat. However, it also contained the slowest parts of the game, so it was bittersweet from my perspective. If this became the new normal for future games, then it wouldn't bother me combat-wise. However, if this amount of cinematic fluff and constant hand-holding is involved, then I'll just simply pass. The score of the game is once again incredible and used extremely well. It wouldn't surprise me if I added some tracks to my personal playlist to listen while driving. Aesthetically, the realms are pretty memorable, however the maps are still atrocious to look at, and I don't know why they went with such a bland look, which makes navigating through a level a bore. I purposely try to avoid looking at them because something about its low detailed display I find really discouraging. I really do appreciate the faster travel this time, though since this is still a PS4 game, the whole loading realm is back. And if the game was built on the PS5 instead, then we would have a Demon's Souls instant loading speed, which would have been nice. I guess it's still better than a loading screen in general, which feels so antiquated these days. I feel so spoiled saying that. The presentation is some of the best I've seen in gaming ever, and I'll definitely be looking up specific cutscenes on YouTube just to rewatch them. The acting is incredible with cutscenes that had me instantly on edge of my squeaking seat. Another thing that this series has always perfected, and that's the character design. Each personality is unique and outfitted with many stories to ponder just by looking at them. Some actions taking place in the background is still well performed and interesting to look at, especially at the end. Anything that made me think on my own was appreciated, since the game is mostly designed to hold your hand most of the way, which was personally insulting. I have to go back into more problems now that I'm on the subject. I'm sure most are aware that the constant hints from characters is one of the most glaring issues in the game, that cannot be disabled unless you toggle off the subtitles and mute the television. The puzzles are at elementary level solutions, yet the game thinks we're incapable of thinking on our own. The only puzzles I slightly enjoyed were the symbol chests, that some required observation and timing. However, once you see one, you have seen them all basically, especially if you played the 2018 title. Going back to the encounters I loved, like the duo fights, which oddly seem to have the most clever solutions compared to the other fights. I don't know if the developers simply put more thought into how a two-boss concept could work together, but they really nailed it in my opinion, and were the most satisfying and rewarding sections of the game for me. For an example, the duo stone ancient fight, which at first glance seems ridiculous due to the existing knowledge of their attack behavior. However, they seem adjusted to become more like arena obstacles while you clean the area of smaller enemies, then you can handle them afterwards. Figuring out this solution may seem simple, but I was starving for skill-based battle solutions at this point in the game. And it was a huge breath of fresh air that I wish remained longer, because the fights afterwards were not as interesting to me, with one fight having a design error that caused a large enemy not to register with an upward slope. My biggest gripe is the constant filler of slow walking and fetch quests that's basically the same mission for several hours in the middle of the story. During this time, there was no fresh combat concepts revealed to keep things at least interesting. If this entire section of the game was removed, I wouldn't miss it, and the game would be well paced and less tiring. Perhaps a lot of my concerns could be resolved by playing on the normal difficulty, but I didn't want to risk a boring first half due to simplistic encounters, which is why I'm not a huge fan of difficulty options, but that's a conversation for a different video. Am I the only gamer that's tired of following NPCs in gaming? It's not for very long distances, but it restricts speed sometimes and cannot be skipped among the other interactive cinematics that are much longer. But since there's minor enemy encounters and quick time events, you cannot skip the entire thing to carry on with the main core of the game. I understand doing something like that at the end of the game, but way before it is atrociously dull for me to experience on multiple playthroughs. There was one moment that made me feel like I was in the immersion of the pre-2018 games, and what I thought was a build-up to something special just faded into nothingness. This happens several times in the main story where it teases something interesting and yet leads to the most safe and predictable outcome. There wasn't one moment that surprised me and continued to keep me glued into the story from that point, only because there's such a low risk in the storytelling. I did find a scene where Kratos sees a horse and asks,
"What is that?"
but I found it hilarious because of how random it was, and after that does lead to a really creepy scene that again builds up to nothing. A moment with Thor was really thrilling and unexpected, I must say. However, once again, that was a dud of a build-up. To wrap up the longest review I have written for a video game, I will conclude by saying that God of War Ragnarok has very important life messages for the world to hear. However, if only they weren't constantly reminding us about them during the whole game. If you have a message, then deliver it once in a memorable way and don't dilute it with dragging it along. Personally, for me, the story didn't go anywhere interesting or risky, and I'm not excited for a continuation. I believe God of War finished at a first end of the world, and this new world isn't something I want to be a part of, especially with how much structure is focused on cinematic padding, even with the quick time events not being as impactful like they were before. I'm glad the series is still successful and the players love it, however it has turned into a genre that doesn't interest me anymore. Next time, instead of spending $70, I'm going to watch a YouTube playthrough instead, but only if the story looks remotely significant in pulling my interest. I'm not saying Ragnarok is a bad game at all, and I wish there was more praise I could give it among the many problems I have addressed. I still plan on eventually doing some side missions I totally skipped to see if there's more encounters that are uniquely and cleverly designed, because I still adore the gameplay, but only when the right components work well like a clock. The nature of time and gears need each other in order to have a completely functional masterpiece in design. I'm giving God of War Ragnarok a price rating of $45 without taxes. I hope I was able to articulate how I felt about my concerns in the game at a comprehending level, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
It's over. A lot of people in the audience look pissed.